patch of order. And yet we come to church, or at least we did this morning, which is odd. Because if you come to church, you're liable to hearing the Bible. And if you are liable to hearing the Bible, then you probably at one point or another might find yourself just a tad uncomfortable. I've always found it funny when people have told me, as they have many times, that they avoid the Old Testament because there's just too much in there that's uncomfortable and hard to deal with, and frankly a little backwards. And so they stick with the New Testament and the Gospels and Jesus. I get that impulse. Jesus does seem a little more approachable and accessible than Old Testament God, doesn't he? Old Testament God is always doling out punishment and wrath. Jesus is all about peace and love, man. Except, of course, when he's not. I'll let you in on a preacher's secret. There's one day of the year that every priest wants to take off church, and it's this one. The Sunday when we preach the gospel story about Jesus calling a Gentile woman a dog. This is one of those texts, maybe more than any other, that challenges our sanitized, cleaned up view of Jesus. First, he travels to a region called Tyre, and when he gets there, the text tells us he doesn't want anyone to know that he's there. Not very Jesus-y right out of the gate. So maybe right from the start, our story has Jesus in a bit of a bad mood. Nonetheless, people find him, as they usually do, and a woman whose daughter is suffering comes and asks him to heal her. But this woman is a Gentile, which is a technical term for somebody who's not Jewish. Don't forget, Jesus is very much a Jewish rabbi in a culture and a climate in which tensions between Jews and non-Jews were very high. Palestine at this point has been under Roman occupation for centuries, and in that kind of context, national pride runs high. So Jesus, who seems to be having a bit of an off day, tells the woman that it's not fair to take what was intended for the children of Israel and throw it to the dogs. This is shocking for us. But for a first century Jew, this is pretty much the standard way that you talk about Gentiles. And that should be the end of it. But the woman pushes him further and says, fine, I'm a dog. But even dogs get to eat the crumbs off the children's table. And Jesus gives in. She goes home and finds her daughter healed. The reason that those of us tasked with trying to find something to say about these biblical texts every Sunday like to skip over this one is because try as we might, it doesn't seem to fit what we expect of Jesus, does it? Some stories seem to resist being fit neatly into our theologies about Jesus, about the kind of person he is, the kind of message he shares, the kind of God he witnesses to. Don't get me wrong, plenty of people have tried their hand at making sense of it, at making it fit. Maybe Jesus is just trying to teach us something here. Maybe he doesn't mean what he says to the woman, it's just an object lesson for the disciples. That's a tricky interpretation for me, because whether he means it or not, it's a pretty unpleasant thing to say. Or maybe there's nuance here that we're not capturing. Maybe in the ancient world, people loved their dogs the way people love their dogs now. Trust me, if I told you that I feel about you the way I feel about my Dachshund, it would be the highest compliment I'm capable of. But no, we can't let Jesus off the hook that easily. He says what he says, and it means what it means. And so what I think this text really invites us into, the question that it calls out of us, is what are we to do when Jesus runs up against what we think he should be like? When Jesus shatters our expectations? We all have models and images for who we think Jesus is. Some might say a great teacher, or a shepherd, or a perfect moral example. Even people who want nothing to do with the church tend to have a fairly rosy view of the man at the center of the Christian faith. And so when Jesus does something unexpected, something that doesn't seem very Jesus-y, we struggle to fit it into our model for who we think he's supposed to be. We all have a tendency to try to make Jesus fit our theologies, don't we? But of course, that's backwards. Because actually, what Christianity offers us uniquely is not a theology or a doctrine or a creed first and foremost, but a person. Beliefs and theologies can be pretty rigid things. They can be hard to change or challenge. When we come across some new idea or belief, we either find a way to slot it into our current system without upsetting the apple cart, or we throw it away. But people are notoriously resistant to being boxed in, and none more so perhaps than Jesus. Jesus was always cracking open people's small imaginations, the perennial tendency to squeeze him into boxed-in theologies and expectations for what he's supposed to be like. And often the way to crack our theologies open is to do what Jesus does in today's gospel, to shock and to startle us. Maybe instead of pressing Jesus to our neat theologies, what we really need is more imaginative, expansive models for who Jesus is. There's a long and beloved tradition among our Eastern Orthodox cousins in the church. In the Orthodox tradition, they have a long history of saints that don't quite fit the mold of typical sainthood. They're not stellar examples of morality and Christian virtue. Some of them are downright rude, and others seem to have more than a few screws loose. But somehow, they embody a radically different and Christ-like way of being in the world, a purity or a courage that we don't see very often. The Orthodox Church came to call these figures holy fools. St. Francis may be our best example in the Western Church, a fool for Christ, who sells everything and spends the rest of his life preaching to the birds and wild animals. Francis called himself God's court jester. You've probably run up against these kinds of characters elsewhere too. They make an appearance in quite a bit of our movies and literature. Think of Don Quixote, the great Spanish literary figure, the lunatic who thinks he's a knight-errant in a world where knights-errant don't exist anymore. Or a little closer to our own time, Forrest Gump, the misfit beacon of purity and generosity caught up in a world of war and hate. What these holy fools often embody for us is a radically different way of being, one so different that to live it out looks like folly or insanity to the world around them. As Don Quixote beautifully put it, when life itself seems lunatic, who knows where madness lies? Perhaps to be too practical is madness, or to surrender dreams. This may be madness. Too much sanity may be madness, and maddest of all, to see life as it is and not as it should be. Or in the words of that great fool for Christ, St. Paul, God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. The beautiful paradox about these characters that we find so compelling is that you can't quite tell whether they're sane or insane, rude or polite, or even whether they're moral or immoral. They simply transcend and break apart the easy categories that we try so hard to fit everything into. What they're really doing is shattering the very idea behind those categories, the expectations that we have for what a person should be like. They challenge us to think about whether being nice and polite and well-behaved is really what's asked of a follower of Christ, or whether we tend to mistake being nice for being Christian. So when we run into difficult texts like this, moments in which Jesus challenges and maybe shatters our expectations for what Jesus is supposed to be like, and we find ourselves wondering what we should do with these stories, the answer is not easy, but it is simple. That it is not for us to make Jesus fit our theologies, but rather to always be willing to shape our theologies around Jesus. We start not with belief, but with a person who will always surprise and startle us and invite us to see things differently. Or even better, maybe we don't force things to fit at all. We simply let Jesus be what he is and will be. We allow ourselves to be challenged and unnerved and disturbed by this person that despite 2,000 years of trying will simply not be made to fit our expectations. For ours is a faith that stands or falls not on a theology, but on a person who witnesses to a God that is always beyond all we can ask or imagine. May we have the courage to let God surprise us again. Thanks be to God.